the screen here. Okay, Miriam, you should be able to speak to us today.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Yep, I can hear you.
Hopefully everybody else can as well.
Yep, should be. And you should have control of
the channel?
Yep, you should be. My computer's running a little slow.
On my end. Not quite yet. Let's see. Let's try that. Okay. So hopefully we'll be able to advance the slides. Hopefully you have the title slide there. Welcome everybody. I'm not sure how many of folks were on the call on Tuesday, but I really enjoyed it, and I also really appreciated the very thoughtful questions that came in that we addressed during the webinar and that I addressed by email afterwards. So please, if you have a question, don't hesitate to send it in to Tanya, and we'll either answer it during the broadcast or by email afterwards. So I wanted to just review the objectives for the training that we have that most of you received when you signed up for the webinar. The objectives that I created for the training are to know the physical, behavioral, and emotional indicators for child sexual abuse, to understand how development and cultural differences affect disclosures and responses, individual children's responses to child sexual abuse, to understand more about the offending cycle and the range of victim responses, psychosocial emotional responses to child sexual abuse, a brief understanding of the roles and responsibilities of professionals who become involved in investigating cases of child sexual abuse, and an appreciation for what behaviors between minors must be reported, involving minors or between minors must be reported under the California Child Abuse Reporting Law, which is probably a training unto itself, but we'll do our best to address that. So here's our agenda. We're going to start with some of the definitions and indicators of child sexual abuse, and then we're going to talk about how sexual abuse happens. And what I want to say about that from the outset is that we don't have an answer to the question, why does sexual abuse occur? We have some information about the offending cycle and dynamics among offenders and dynamics among victims, but we don't really have a scientific answer to why sexual abuse happens. What we do have an appreciation for is how it happens and how the dynamics of the different players, the offender, the victim, and sometimes non-offending parents, how those kind of conspire together to create a situation in which child sexual abuse can occur and can go unreported for long periods of time. So that's what we're going to be discussing as we talk about how it happens. Then we're going to briefly look at mandated reporting of children's sexual behaviors and the roles and responsibilities of the professionals involved in the cases. So I want to start with a definition so that we're all kind of on the same page about this. So in general, child sexual abuse is any sexual activity with a child below the legal age of consent. And that varies state by state, ranging in age from 14 to 18. In California, our age of consent is 18, meaning that even two 17-year-olds who are engaged in consensual, agreed-upon sexual behavior with each other, it is technically illegal because our age of consent is 18. That does not mean that all situations involving minors are always reportable. There is a difference between what is technically illegal and what is reportable, and we'll be talking about that later in the webinar. But in general, if you are under 18 in California, it's illegal to be engaging in sexual activity. Contacts or interactions with a child below the legal age of consent in which the child is used for the sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or another person. And that's what distinguishes non-sexual intent kinds of genital contact, anogenital contact, from something that's potentially illegal. So it's not illegal for us to check the genitalia of kids that we're caring for, either as parents or doctors or other professionals, if that's in the scope of our job, and it's not for the sexual intent or sexual stimulation of the adult or older person. Sexual abuse really involves some lewd intent on the part of the older person involved. Our legal definition for child sexual abuse comes in the Penal Code. It's Penal Code section 11166.1. And if you're interested in actually reading that law, take a pencil. Here comes the website for it. It's www.leginfo.com. L-E-G, like in legislation, info, all one word, leginfo.com. And if you do get online and look at the way our child abuse reporting law and child abuse definitions are in California, you'll see that there's two sections of it. The A section of 11166.1 actually goes crime by crime of what is considered sexual abuse in the state of California. And then there's a B section, and what that B section describes is conduct. So not necessarily the crime per se, but what kind of touching, what kind of behavior is construed as child sexual abuse. And the way that that B section is written, it says including but not limited to these kinds of behaviors. And what that enables people who are mandated reporters to do is, if you have some concern about the sexual activity, even if it's not specifically described in that B section, the fact that it says including but not limited to allows you to report child sexual abuse without worry about the privilege or confidentiality of your relationship if you're concerned about it, because the child abuse reporting law accounts for an exception to child abuse, to confidentiality and privilege. Okay, so again, this is a more general definition. It's not specifically from the Penal Code, but it's from the clinical literature, that what we see, and we'll describe these dynamics more, is that child sexual abuse always involves a power differential. So that is what really distinguishes something that's child sexual abuse or something that's manipulative or forceful from the kinds of sexual behaviors that we talked about on Tuesday that do happen between children who are of similar age, similar power, similar status, similar size, similar developmental status. That's what distinguishes those kinds of activities from something that is more sexually abusive. It's really the chronological or developmental or power differentials that make one person really unable to consent to something in the same way and appreciate the consequences of the sexual involvement in the same way. So when you look through all of the different crimes and descriptions of behavior, there's a broad range of what constitutes child sexual abuse, from intrafamilial sexual abuse to something occurring with somebody outside the family, extrafamilial sexual abuse, molestation, child rape, or other kinds of child sexual assault. The clinical and legal definition of sexual assault or rape generally includes a penetration of some kind as opposed to touching or molestation. We also have laws, both state laws and federal laws, about sexual exploitation, survival sex, pornography. Now we have sexting involved in that, because sending images over telephone wires or the internet is actually against the law. It's considered some aspect of child pornography. We also include in child sexual abuse unlawful sexual intercourse. That's the legal term for statutory rape. And sexual abuse can also include non-contact offenses, such as developmentally inappropriate sexually stimulating activities and materials, so showing those to kids. So this next slide is just kind of a different way of explaining that spectrum of behaviors that include non-contact offenses and the range of contact offenses that are illegal in California. The specific penal code sections, if you do go online, this is not an exhaustive list, but it is a list of the most common charged sexual abuse offenses in the state of California. And you can see that some of them are age-related, although they all relate to people who are under the age of 18, who are minors. Several of them have specific age ranges that later go on and relate to our duties as mandated reporters. So they include, these can include activities even when they're consensual if they're technically illegal in the state of California. So for example, unlawful sexual intercourse is something that can be charged whenever there's somebody under the age of 18 engaged in sexual behavior with somebody that they're legally not able to consent to the activity with. Sometimes it's a felony, sometimes it's a misdemeanor, but it is technically against the law. And one of the reasons that it remains on the books in California, in other states, statutory rape or unlawful sexual intercourse applies to kids under 16 or applies to kids under 14. In California, it has stayed on the books as something under the age of 18, in large part because of some of the clinical dynamics that get observed in this population, where teenagers are getting involved with older people, specifically older men, and the age gaps actually can be quite substantial. So we're not necessarily talking about a 17-year-old with her 19-year-old boyfriend or his 19-year-old boyfriend, but we're talking about 16, 17, 15-year-olds who are involved with men who are in their 40s, who fathered multiple babies with teenage moms. And that is one of the things that keeps this kind of on the forefront in California. The knowledge that 71% of babies born to teens are fathered by adult men, and that the younger the girl, the more likely the age gap is more substantial. If you are 12 and fathering a child, chances are the father of your baby is over the age of 20. So we pay attention to these crimes as a form of child sexual abuse. Okay, so the prevalence, it's very difficult to really truly establish the full scope of prevalence. And part of the reason is because there's totally different sources and different sources for clinical information, different sources for formal data collection for child welfare and law enforcement. There's no uniform national, national reporting system that can collect crimes across states in a uniform manner. But one of the main reasons that it's really difficult to truly establish the prevalence of child sexual abuse is because the majority of child sexual abuse goes unreported. We can only collect data from crimes that are reported to child welfare or to law enforcement. The rest of prevalence is assessed, generally speaking, by reviews of the kinds of cases that do get reported and some generalizing to the broader population, and also through adult retrospective reports that are sample unbiased, meaning they're just kind of a general population that's screened for age and socioeconomic status and race and ethnicity and gender and all those kinds of things to make it a non-biased sampling. And then they look at adult retrospective reports and they ask questions about what happened when someone was a child, what kinds of things happened. And so from those kinds of data sources, we come up with an estimate about the prevalence of child sexual abuse. And you could argue with these numbers slightly, but generally speaking, 1 out of every 4 girls and 1 out of 6 to 8 boys, and we think boys are probably underreported for a variety of reasons. Those are the generally accepted statistics. You might see some research that says 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 6 girls. You might see research that says 1 out of 4 boys, and that's again because of the differences and the lack of uniformity in reporting sources. If you want to read more about reporting sources and prevalence of child sexual abuse, I've put a reference there on that slide for you to look at as a starting place. I want to talk about the indicators of possible sexual abuse, because this is, you'll notice that I think there's probably only 1 slide on this, and this is one of the things that people often come to these trainings for. They, just like we talked about last week, having a checklist would be really easy to be able to say, yes, this is normative behavior, this is non-normative behavior, and be able to see it on a list. We'd like to do the same thing with child sexual abuse, but the truth of the matter is that there aren't a lot of gold standard kinds of indicators, things that we can absolutely hang our hat on, that the symptom that we're seeing is due to child sexual abuse. So when we look at physical indicators, there are particularly few. The first one is pregnancy. So if you have a child who is pregnant, you can be pretty gosh darn sure that there was some sexual activity involved. And if it comes along with a report of some kind of sexual behavior that was either manipulative or coercive that ended in the pregnancy, that's a pretty good indicator that there was possible sexual abuse. There are also certain sexually transmitted diseases that can only be passed through sexual contact. And those ones that are absolutely gold standard having to do with sexual contact would be syphilis, gonorrhea, and there's one more, and I'm having a brain bleep on it. It'll come back to me in just a minute. But there are other common sexually transmitted diseases, such as chlamydia, genital warts, vaginal and anal herpes, that are definitely red flags and should always be reported. If you're not a medical expert in child sexual abuse, those occurring in a child have a very high incidence of child sexual abuse as a cause, but there may be other explanations, such as prenatal exposure from the mother that occur in young children and may have some kind of a delayed appearance or onset. There are also some sexually transmitted diseases that can be passed with fomite transmission, meaning something on a towel, something on a toilet seat, something on a bathroom counter, and there are even some that have self-inoculation. For example, herpes. If you have a herpes sore in your mouth and then you touch your genitalia, it's possible to self-inoculate. So there are some other routes of transmission. So STDs, although they're a huge red flag and should always be evaluated, are not absolutely definitively passed through sexual abuse contact. When children do get forensic medical exams, only, and this is a generous estimate, 15%, probably less, of sexual abuse cases can actually end up with conclusive medical findings. And that's because the vast majority of sexual abuse that happens doesn't involve penetrating kinds of situations or injuries. Perpetrators don't want to injure children because that's how they would get caught. So fondling and showing kids things and oral contact and having kids touch the perpetrator, none of those things would ever leave a mark that would be seen on a child. And even if there has been some kind of penetration, sometimes the child's experience of it going way inside is not actually what happens. There's a wonderful doctor in Oakland, California, who describes a lot of penile genital contact as a hot dog in a bun. So it's not something going into the hole of a donut. It's more like a hot dog in a bun, but the sensation for kids is much more like it's going inside because there's pressure, but that would not leave a lasting mark that somebody could pick up on a forensic medical exam. So physical indicators are not usually the way that we get sexual abuse brought to our attention as professionals. Other ways that we get sexual abuse brought to our attention is through behavioral indicators. But the problem with behavioral indicators is that if we were in a more interactive workshop, I would ask you to just do a shout out with me of the kinds of behavioral indicators you might expect to see with sexual abuse, and I would guess that the hands would go up and things would start popping out like, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, suicidality, acting out, school problems, other kinds of, acting out kinds of behavioral things, depression, not wanting to go to the situation where the perpetrator is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with those indicators is that we would generate exactly the same list if I were to ask you to say, tell me what the behavioral indicators might be of a child who's experiencing stress or distress because their parents are getting divorced, because one of their parents has cancer, because they've just moved and they have absolutely no friends in their new school and they miss their old place. So kids have a limited repertoire of behaviors to show that they're under distress. And so we can't distinguish just on the basis of behavioral indicators. We also can't distinguish between forms of child maltreatment based on this. We'd have the same list if a child was experiencing physical abuse. In terms of the behavioral indicators, we'd have the same list for physical abuse, for witnessing domestic violence, or for significant forms of neglect. So behavioral indicators are something we should be aware of, but again, they're not diagnostic of sexual abuse. Same thing with sexual behavioral indicators, and because we talked a lot about this on Tuesday, I'm not going to go into it, but I think those people who participated on Tuesday now have an appreciation that there are kids who have sexual behavior problems who have not been sexually abused, and there are kids who have been sexually abused who exhibit absolutely no sexual behaviors. So while it's important to note them, they're not diagnostic either. The main avenue that we have of getting information about child sexual abuse is when kids disclose, and we're going to be talking quite a bit about dynamics and issues and disclosure in the next half hour, 40 minutes. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now is trying to start to answer the question, how does child sexual abuse happen? And there's a very early article in the field of child sexual abuse. The citation is there, and a lot of the material is actually available online. But if you go to a librarian, I'm sure they can pull this old book. I think it's still in print, actually. And then Dr. Finkelhor, who wrote this book, also wrote numerous articles that appear in professional journals that are still very accessible through libraries. It's an old article, but it's still one of the best that I've ever seen, and so much of the later clinical literature is based upon it that I think it's one of the best and easiest ways to understand how sexual abuse happens. So we're going to talk about this for a minute. David Finkelhor wrote this book and this, I guess it would be a model for understanding how sexual abuse happens, called the 4 preconditions model of child sexual abuse. And according to this model, there actually have to be 4 things that happen in order for a child to be sexually abused. And if any one of these are absent, child sexual abuse would not occur in an individual situation. The first, what he calls precondition, is the potential offender has some motivation to sexually abuse a child. I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail in just a minute. But the second precondition is that the potential offender overcomes internal inhibitions. Most of us have an understanding, even if we were tempted to do something that is illegal or unethical or not okay, things that inhibit us from doing that. The same is true in child sexual abuse. But for child sexual abuse to occur, there has to be some process that happens on the part of the perpetrator that he or she is able to overcome those internal inhibitors. So the first 2 preconditions relate to the perpetrator. The third precondition is that a potential offender overcomes external impediments. Basically, there's an opportunity for child sexual abuse to occur, and sometimes some perpetrators work very hard to actually create a situation where there's going to be an opportunity. It's often not an accident. It's actually often planful on the part of the perpetrator. And then the fourth piece is that in some way the potential perpetrator overcomes the resistance of the child. And that doesn't necessarily mean physical resistance. A lot of it means psychological, developmental overcoming as well, and we'll see that in just a minute. Sorry, I'm going to go back a slide. So I want to explain these in a little bit more detail because this is really the core, I think, of understanding how sexual abuse happens. So in this first precondition, there has to be a motivation on the part of the perpetrator to abuse a child. And this, understanding this really helps to understand some of the myths about child sexual abuse. The vast majority of perpetrators of sexual abuse, or child molesters, as we would kind of call them in the clinical literature, are not pedophiles. A pedophile is somebody, if you look at the DSM diagnosis, it's somebody who has a near exclusive attraction to prepubertal children and doesn't really have any sexual relationships with peers or other age-appropriate partners. And the vast majority of child molesters actually do. Their relationship with the child is not their exclusive sexual outlet. There's some other motivator or some other emotional need or psychopathology that is involved in child sexual abuse. It's not just, I'm exclusively attracted to children. And some of these reasons that somebody might have a motivation to abuse somebody may be related to some kind of emotional need that the child is meeting rather than just sexual interest. For example, somebody with really low self-esteem or somebody who is just having a lot of troubles elsewhere in their life, gets attracted to children because of their developmental abilities to just accept you like you are, et cetera, and so they kind of misplace some of those emotional needs in order to feel powerful or needed or accepted or things like that. There may be some perpetrators who are reenacting kind of a power thing, trying to finally be the one who's the powerful one if they had a child sexual abuse or other trauma history of their own. There are some perpetrators who fit that profile. However, this is another myth that's really important to understand. The vast majority of people who molest children were not molested themselves as children. We used to think that, partly from some of the early studies that weren't controlled for as well as some of our newer studies. But we also used to think that because that is a really good explanation for helping understand the cycle of physical abuse and neglect that happens. That when people grow up, they basically rear children in similar ways to the way that they were reared. And so it makes a lot of sense in neglect and physical abuse. It does not hold to be true in child sexual abuse. There is a population, perhaps up to 40%, of child sexual abusers who were abused themselves as children in a sexual way, but probably 60% or more of adult males who molest children, that is not the route of how they got to be a molester. The routes are probably more similar to other antisocial kinds of behaviors or criminal pathways. So having a yucky childhood is definitely one of those pathways. Witnessing domestic violence, being physically abused, not having your needs met as a child leads people towards this path much more often, actually, than having a history of child sexual abuse. If you are an adult male perpetrator. If you're a female perpetrator, there is a much higher incidence of child sexual abuse history, at least from the limited research samples that we have. And also, if you are a juvenile who is engaging in illegal sexual behaviors or molesting younger children, about 70% of those appear to have child sexual abuse in their history. So that's what I want to say about the kind of emotional needs. There is also, for the motivation, sometimes that sexual arousal, which we talked about for people who are really sexually attracted to children and more of a true pedophile. And the other explanation that Dr. Finkelhor talked about is something called blockage, where basically you may have had perfectly fine sexual relationships with age-appropriate peers, but for whatever reason, your sources of your normal sexual gratification are not available to you, and so you turn to children. The second piece is overcoming the internal inhibitors, and very simply that means that if any adult had an inclination to do something, there would be messages and we would not act on something because we know it's wrong. But for a perpetrator who goes ahead and molests children, they basically have done something. They have some kind of cognitive dissonance, cognitive reasoning that allows them to move forward with this. And they express that to themselves. Interestingly, they sometimes express it to the children. I've had kids disclose to me in the course of their interviews that the perpetrator said to them things like, when you grow up, you're gonna learn how to do this, so I want to be the one to teach you. So there's some kind of thought, which sounds probably crazy to most of you listening, but there's some way that perpetrators twist messages about social taboos of child sexual abuse to make it fit their reality, so that they move forward on the sexual abuse activity. The third piece of this is overcoming external inhibitors. And basically what this means is child sexual abuse is a crime of opportunity. There has to be an opportunity for a older person, an adult or an older person in position of power to have opportunity alone in the absence of supervising people. Child sexual abuse almost always occurs in secret when it's just the perpetrator and the child. And so children who are isolated, children who don't have a lot of supervision, children who really, or their families, are hungry for the attentions of somebody, are at higher risk. It doesn't mean that you know, children from really wonderful families never get abused. That I've had lots of cases like that. But in many situations, the perpetrator is actually manipulating the environment to create a situation where they're going to be alone with a child. That helps explain how coaches, and actually we're in the middle of the Penn State trial. I guess we'd be remiss in not mentioning that. It's a great example, at least, of what's come out in the media so far about how somebody could find children who might want to engage in a relationship where they get attention and some of their needs met, and how somebody may manipulate a situation to have alone time with the child. It's a great example. And the last piece is overcoming the child's resistance. And less commonly does that mean actual force. More commonly, what it means is that kids are coerced or manipulated because of their developmental limitations. They're not on the same cognitive level and appreciating the consequences of the sexual activity in the same way. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to victim dynamics. But it's not usually force, although that does sometimes happen. It's much more often a manipulation of the relationship and a manipulation of the messages about what other people might think about this and how other people might think about it. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the offender dynamics, although I think our Finkelhor model really explains a lot of this. More current writing, you can look up anything by Anna Salter, who is a really wonderful writer, and she has some videotapes. If this is an area of interest to someone, where she's actually videotaped offenders talking about their process, their cycle. And what she describes is that there's kind of phases of abuse. First, there has to be some kind of arousal, which we talked about, physical arousal, emotional arousal. And then there's a process of accessing victims. And what she says about this is that it's not usually an accident. It's usually planned. It can be opportunistic. It's usually planned where, as we were just saying, somebody kind of puts themselves in a position where they're going to be able to meet kids and have kids come to trust them, because the vast majority of sexual abuse is perpetrated by someone that the child knows and trusts, and oftentimes somebody that the child's family has come to know and trust. Then there is some grooming. I have in parentheses or force, because some child sexual abuse or assault is accomplished by force. It's accomplished by, you know, the stranger that comes and jumps out from behind a building at knife point and rapes or sexually assaults a child. But the vast majority of child sexual abuse, as opposed to adult sexual assault, is in the context of a relationship. And so the relationship starts with some grooming, where the perpetrator is warming the child up, gaining the child's trust, sometimes giving them gifts and other things to kind of become ingratiated, and also beginning some sexually exploitive behaviors that may not go from 0 to 100 very quickly, but may just kind of desensitize the child to some kind of physical touch. It can go on for a long time, where you sit together on a couch and watch movies together, kind of really snuggled up close under a blanket with a hand on a thigh, before it ever moves on to anything more overtly sexual. But at some point it does become more sexual. And at that point, and we'll talk about this piece more when we talk about the victim dynamics, there is some dynamic about keeping this a secret, because if most kids ran and told right away, sexual abuse would probably, we'd have this problem licked. But the vast majority of kids actually do not tell after their first incident or after many incidents of sexual abuse. So there's some process of maintaining the secrecy, and oftentimes that is perpetuated by kind of the feelings that come up about this, the shame, the guilt, the wondering what other people are going to think, the self-blame, etc. The cycle only stops when either the sexual abuse stops and kind of things get suppressed inside the victim for long periods of time. That's sometimes why we end up with people who were victims of sexual abuse in childhood presenting as adults in mental health clinics, because they've been holding this in for a really long time, or because the child discloses, and we'll talk more about the disclosure process. get this to advance. There we go. Okay, so many of these offender myths we've talked about. There is no typical molester profile. We used to think that we could kind of target and figure out who somebody was. We all have a picture in our heads about what somebody might look like, but we actually cannot do that. There's no typical molester profile, nor do molesters always target the same kind of child. So there is a small subgroup of offenders who are very specific. They like 7-year-old blonde-haired boys, and that's always who they molest. But the vast majority of offenders have something called crossover phenomenon, where even though we get this information from studies of incarcerated sex offenders who basically get granted immunity to talk about the kinds of sex offenses that they committed prior to their being caught and their subsequent incarceration. And what they tell us is that even if they, let's say, got arrested for molesting a male, 62% of them will say that they also molested a female. If they got arrested for molesting a female, 23% also admitted to molesting a male. There's also the same kind of crossover effect where if they got arrested and caught because they molested somebody in their family, they also later admit to having prior molested people outside their family, and vice versa. If they got arrested for molesting a child, the vast majority of them also admitted to molesting adolescents or even to raping adults. So there's a huge crossover effect, which is why in child welfare, if there's any child welfare folks around, it is really important to take a look and protect all siblings. Just because somebody got caught doesn't mean that there isn't something happening with other kids or that they're caught up in some of the same unhealthy emotional dynamics. Okay, I mentioned this briefly. I'm not going to spend much time on this, mostly because there's very few studies on female offenders, because again, the only population that we can really study is people who are incarcerated. And because so few people get caught and so few people actually get prosecuted, it's a limited sampling. There's even fewer female offenders who have actually been caught, incarcerated, and agree to participate in the study. But this is some of the findings of some of those studies. It's kind of a summary of what those studies will say. So most of what we know is about adult male incarcerated offenders. Trying to get this, oh, there we go. Okay. We talked briefly about this on Tuesday, so I'll just repeat it because it fits in here for those of you who weren't with us on Tuesday. The juveniles account for 30 to 50% of child molest and 20% of adolescent and adult sexual assault. The difference between this population and an adult population is that most juveniles will age out of inappropriate sexual behavior just like they do other adolescent risk-taking dumb behavior. Just like, you know, if you're 30, you're not as likely to go get into a car drunk and drive, or you're not as likely to, I don't know, steal something. Crime peaks in adolescence and early 20s of all crimes and then decreases because our brain finally kicks in with the judgment and things like that. So the same thing is true for sexual assault. Most juveniles will age out of this. 85%, this is even without treatment, even if they're never caught and even if they never get any treatment, 85% will not reoffend in adulthood, and only 5 to 15% will show up in the adult population of sex offenders. So if somebody had their first offense when they were a minor, only that they were caught for, only 5 to 15% of them will show up in the adult population of sex offenders. And there is a great article that I've cited on the bottom which really summarizes the research to date as of 2008. I think it's still quite current, the information that's in there, in the ASAC advisor, so that citation is on your slide. Okay, let's talk about the victims. Just like the early 80s had that publication of the original article that described how things happened, there was also a publication in the early 1980s called the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. It was published in 1983 in the Journal of Child Maltreatment or Child Abuse and Neglect. I'll have to think about that. Child Abuse and Neglect. And you can Google it. You just have to be really careful when you Google it. It's available online in its entirety, but sometimes when you Google it, it happens to be appearing on either like a pedophile website or a defense attorney website. And so it's got some, you just got to be careful about what you're looking at. Make sure you're looking at a reputable online site. But basically, in 1983, Dr. Summit, who was a psychiatrist in Los Angeles, wrote an article. It was not a research article, but he basically described the dynamics in the hundreds, probably thousands of cases that were coming to his attention in the early 1980s of child sexual abuse. It was kind of the time of the discovery of the phenomenon of child sexual abuse in the professional literature. There had been a few things written before this, but this was one of the landmark articles. And basically what he did was he just described the dynamics that he would see commonly happening with victims. And the first thing that he described was secrecy. The child sexual abuse was a crime that occurred in secret, and the vast majority of kids kept it a secret and did not tell. And while this was not a research article, subsequent research, up to research appearing in 2012, finds this to be accurate, that roughly 2/3 of people grow up and never tell anyone about child sexual abuse until they happen to get some cold call on a standardized, randomized research thing. So about 2/3 of people grow up into adulthood and do not tell. Then what Dr. Summit described as something called helplessness. So that was pretty clear when we were talking about the physical and developmental limitations of kids in the face of molest by somebody who's an adult. But what Dr. Summit added was that there's also this emotional helplessness that happens, and part of that occurs because of the messaging that the perpetrator gives the child, that the people that kids would normally go to for help with any kind of problems kind of get rendered obsolete by kind of some of the messaging that the perpetrator gives them. This is our special secret, nobody else will understand. If somebody else finds out about it, I might get in trouble, we might not get to see each other again, people would be mad, so-and-so would cry, I'd go to jail, blah, blah, blah. So they get a lot of messages, and what that means is they're kind of left alone to figure this out. And what happens when they're left alone is what Dr. Summit called entrapment and accommodation. They are stuck, they are trapped in this relationship. And so the average child, the typical healthy child, will accommodate to the abuse. They will just try and figure out how to live with it, how to kind of go on with their life. And for some kids, this is what helps explain why some kids show behavioral symptoms and some don't. It's very individual. Some kids show a lot of signs of distress. They get anxious, they get depressed, they have school problems, they act out. They're trying to cope with the abuse and they can't, and so it leaks out in some other maladaptive kinds of behaviors. But for some kids, the way that they cope with it is by kind of packaging it, and the rest of their life they're doing great. They're the captain of the football team, or the head of the cheerleader, or the head of the debate team, and straight A student, and in the church choir, and they're really looking great on the outside because they're working hard at kind of packaging it, and it's only when the packaging fails that they may become symptomatic, and that happens for some people and not for others. Then what Dr. Summit described is that if and when kids do disclose, their disclosure is often delayed, unconvincing, hesitant, conflicted, and it doesn't come out in a nice, neat package with a beginning and a middle and an end. It comes out in pieces, they kind of test the waters, they wait to see what the response is, and because it doesn't come out in a nice, neat package, it tends to be ignored or not accepted by the listener. And so kids sometimes shut down, they don't tell the whole thing. Or it's easy for us who really don't want to believe that sexual abuse really happens to think, oh, they're making this up, and then the kids clam up and the disclosure doesn't happen. When kids do disclose, what Dr. Summit said in his original article is that the average child will recant or retract their statement. And he, at the time he wrote the article, that was happening in nearly all of the cases that he saw. Subsequent literature shows that somewhere between 4 and 22% of kids will at some point recant a statement that they made about sexual abuse, and then the vast majority of those will go on to later reassert and explain the recantation. But for the most part, these dynamics, all of them that he wrote about in 1983, have been borne out in the current literature. If you're interested in a summary of the current literature, there's a great article by Olafson and Lederman, and it's written in a journal for dependency court judges. And their findings, in brief, are, as we described, the majority, 2/3 of victims do not disclose their childhood during childhood, if ever. When children do disclose during childhood, it is often after a long delay of weeks, months, and years, which also, by the way, goes to describe why there's very few medical findings on kids, because bodies heal. Even if there were injuries, bodies heal, bodies change over time, particularly with puberty. And even if there was a little tiny notch or cleft or change to the tissue, it often heals up completely by the time kids have disclosed. When kids are directly asked about child sexual abuse, how their non-offending parent heard the news is a huge predictor of whether they will actually talk to investigators, child welfare workers, law enforcement, and forensic interviewers like me. So how that non-offending parent responds and whether they're believing or not is a huge predictor of whether kids will disclose again for outside investigators. The kinds of things that inhibit disclosures are the relationships. So the abuse by a family member is harder to disclose for a lot of kids than if it's a stranger or somebody outside their family. Some of the age, when it's happening really affects how kids and whether they will tell, because if they've already internalized social norms and thoughts about modesty and embarrassment and it's not okay to talk about sexuality, et cetera, that can contribute to non-disclosure. Some of these other things we have subsequent slides on, so I'm going to move on for the sake of time. We talked briefly about male victims. Again, the numbers that are positive are somewhere around 1 in every 6 to 8 boys. But because of so many additional psychosocial issues and pressures, it is even harder for boys to disclose sexual abuse than it is for girls. There is it just comes, no matter how you slice it, with issues of social acceptance or lack of acceptance about homosexuality. If boys were molested by a male and their body responded, which it almost always does, because there's no way for somebody to touch your penis, whether you want it to be happening or not, and not have it respond. They worry, does that mean that I'm gay? Does it mean that I wasn't gay if I was molested by a woman and something happened and oh my gosh, I thought I was gay? There's no way to escape attaching it to all of the issues related to how society looks at homosexuality. The other reason that it's often more difficult is because sexual abuse of males is often more significant touching. It involves oral copulation. It involves penetration, either of the victim, of the perpetrator. And it often involves multiple victims. And sometimes, especially when it occurs in later school age and adolescence, there's an awareness that this is happening with other kids. And there's a pressure about disclosing or not disclosing because there's kind of a bigger pack here. The other problem is, and maybe not a problem, but something that is noted, is that boys often, get picked up for other issues, school issues, conduct issues, etc. And nobody ever asks them about sexual abuse. They just assume they're hyperactive or they're ADD or they've got conduct problems, which is more common in boys because boys often externalize their feelings much more than the girls do. And it's much harder for boys to walk up and say to somebody, I need help, I need to go to counseling. If you ask any adult male, and they're much more reticent to go and talk about their feelings than any adult woman I know. And the same thing happens in childhood and adolescence. I think close to the last thing I want to say about the dynamics, and then we'll move into prognosis stuff, is the role of shame. And there's a wonderful writer named Lisa Aronson Fontes. You can Google pretty much anything that she has written and come up with the citations. And she writes a lot about cultural aspects of child maltreatment. And one of the things that she says is that shame is pretty universal in child sexual abuse. If you talk to victims about what their primary experience is, it's shame. It's not just embarrassment, but it's shame because of the messages that the kid has said to themselves about it must be my fault, there must be something wrong with me, or why was this happening to me? But there are cultural aspects to shame that she writes about, and that is basically how does a child's family, how does a child's community, how does a child's world, whether it's religion or ethnicity or whatever groups they're involved with, and I use the term culture very, very broadly, what are the messages that they get about aspects of abuse? Those, while shame is universal, those aspects vary from culture to culture. And so the child is also dealing with the messages that are given. And in my experience, those messages can either be the source of shame or they can be the most amazing source of resilience and healing if we can access people in a child's community and culture that are culturally congruent for them and can really support them. So the groups the kids belong to can either be isolating to them or just an amazing source of support and nurturance and holding in the aftermath of disclosure of sexual abuse. If we have more time at the end, I'll share a case example of that, but for the sake of time for now, I'm going to go on. Okay, so people always ask, okay, so what's the long-term effects? What's the prognosis? What do you know about treatment? And while this is not a training on treatment, I'll say a few things about the long-term effects. So we'll talk about symptoms, psychosocial symptoms, and child traumatic stress, and what we know about the efficacy of treatment for sexual abuse. So these next couple of slides are adapted from a curriculum that is out in the public domain that I actually wrote for the National Child Stress Network. If you would like more complete slides, they're in the Child Welfare Trauma Training Toolkit, available on the NCTSN website, and we'll return to that at the end during the resources section. So I'll give you the website for that. But basically, here we go. Child traumatic stress refers to the physical and emotional responses of a child to events that threaten the life or physical integrity of the child or of someone critically important to him or her. Traumatic events overwhelm a child's capacity to cope, elicit feelings of terror, powerlessness, and out-of-control physiological arousal. Sexual abuse is one form of trauma, and not all kids develop child traumatic stress, or more specifically the diagnosis of PTSD, which we'll talk about next. But if their experience of the sexual abuse was either that their life was threatened because of it, somebody actually said, if you tell, I'll kill you, or if you tell, I'll kill your mother, I'll hurt your mother, I'll do this, I'll do that, that certainly would apply. And if the event itself just overwhelms the child's capacity to cope, even if they're not feeling terror, there is almost always a feeling of powerlessness and fear and, oh my gosh, I don't know how to cope with this, that comes with sexual abuse. So about 40% of kids who have a history of child sexual abuse will be diagnosed with PTSD. And here is the DSM diagnosis. It basically means that powerlessness has overwhelmed them. And so here's the definition from the DSM about what PTSD is. Oops. Okay, so the impact of trauma is very individual. That's why only 40% of kids develop PTSD, and 60% of them manage to cope without developing that level of trauma. So it's very, very individual depending on the child's age, developmental stage of when the abuse is happening, and what it interrupts, what developmental trajectories it interrupts. There's also a genetic predisposition or a biological vulnerability to developing PTSD, so something that's more biochemical. So it's really, PTSD completely depends upon the child's perception. The exact same thing could happen to two different kids who will respond entirely differently. It's all about the child's perception of the danger faced, what the nature of the relationship is with the person, and their past experience with trauma. Because if they have a trauma history, trauma kind of compounds. And so if they were vulnerable to begin with, this may be kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. It also is dependent upon what happens after kids disclose. Who responds to them in a supportive way? Both parents and the professionals who become involved. What kinds of adversities does the child experience after the sexual abuse? Does their father that they love or their grandfather get put in jail? And how is that explained to them? Where is the blame put by the people that are important to them? If everybody in their family is mad at them and thinks they're a liar, they're probably going to be more symptomatic with PTSD than if they're in a family who says you did the right thing about telling and this was not your fault. So the impact of the trauma really depends on the child's experience both during the sexual abuse and after. Specific to child sexual abuse are some of these issues. How long the abuse went on and how often it happened, and how severe it was, penetration versus non-penetration offenses. That being said, it is not always true that the kids who are just fondled, and if you could see me in person, I'm putting that in quotes, the just, versus somebody who had some kind of penetrating offense. I can tell you that one of the kids that I saw who was the most traumatized after her sexual abuse experience was a kid who was fondled, this was when I worked in LA County, in Venice Beach, by some crazy guy walking up to her in a convenience store who tweaked her breasts and grabbed her vagina over her clothes and then ran out the store. That was the totality of the sexual contact. But the meaning that she made of that is that the world is just perpetually unsafe because her life was unsafe before that. She had a really troubled family and she really didn't have people to count on. And so literally this confirmed for her that everywhere she turned, the world was an unsafe place. And that was, quote unquote, just one-time fondling over the clothes. I then had a young lady who was kidnapped at knife point on the way to school and pushed into a car. Her hands were tied. She was driven up into a wooded area where she was repeatedly sexually assaulted in every orifice that you could think of. She was abandoned up there in the woods, hiked down to a highway naked and barefoot and picked up by strangers. And she is doing incredibly. And the reason, from a psychosocial point of view, and the reason that she's doing so well is because what happened to her after the molest is that these people that picked her up on the highway, she basically said, I need to go home. I just got sexually assaulted. I want to go home and take a shower and get my clothes. And they said to her, I kid you not, you know, we just watched, like, I don't know, Law and Order or CSI, I don't remember. We just watched a show and you're not supposed to take a shower. You're supposed to go to a hospital and have them collect the evidence so they can catch the person who did this to you. And she was like, okay. And so they drove her to the hospital. They waited with her until her mom came and met her at the hospital. And the other thing that happened is that when she was in the car and she was bound, her hands were bound, she was mouthing silently out the window, help me, help me, help me. And somebody saw that and thought it was weird and wrote down the license plate and called it into the police. And so between that and the DNA evidence collection that happened at the hospital, the perpetrator was apprehended within about 24 hours. And this young lady's perception of the world was that there was one sick person out there, but he was in jail. And the rest of the world basically rose to her defense and helped her. And so the vast majority of people in the world are good, according to her. So it's kind of a good example, those two cases juxtaposed, that trauma is a very individual and really depends, of course, on some objective factors, but really on the individual meaning that a child makes of what has happened to them and the response that they get from others. One of the significant responses that kids should get in the aftermath of child sexual abuse is treatment. And until the early 1990s, we were kind of flying by the seat of our pants. There were few empirical studies about what really, really worked to help kids. And now we're living in a great time where there are certain treatment models, such as trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and some other treatment modalities that are really documenting their efficacy in treating some of the symptoms that happen with child sexual abuse. And TFCBT is just one, but it is one of the most well-researched modalities, and so that's why I'm sharing it here. I don't mean to minimize the efficacy of other researched models, but this one is probably the most well-known. And it includes, I'm not going to go into detail here, but for those of you who are therapists, these are the components of TFCBT and some of the other cognitive behavioral evidence-based models that are really becoming more popular because we can really show a decrease in symptoms. And really what TFCBT does that seems to be the most effective is that it helps kids make meaning and master the symptoms. So where kids come into treatment thinking the sexual abuse was their fault and they should have done more to stop it, and it's all their fault that the perpetrator's in jail, or if they're not in jail, it's all their fault that they can't go over to grandpa's house anymore and everybody in the family is mad at them, it helps them change that message, cognitively reframe that message. And it also includes actual techniques, anxiety reduction techniques that help them with any of the symptoms they have, and just really creating a trauma narrative that is healthy. It doesn't make the abuse go away. It doesn't hide it, but it helps contextualize it in the child's total life. Instead of being everything, it's a piece of the child's life which can be managed and have a message about it that is okay, where they can take it and kind of have the rest of their life and not have this overwhelm their life. Okay, we're going to spend a few minutes talking, we're really switching gears here now from the dynamics of how sexual abuse happens to what professionals need to know about dealing with it. Some of the reporting of child sexual abuse is straightforward. So if you look, and where it's not straightforward, it's because we don't have one single place where instructions for mandated reporters are clear. So the mandated reporting law is included in the Penal Code 11-165, but there is also case law, like lawsuits happen because somebody either reported or didn't report, and then the case law becomes kind of binding, but you would have to know that those cases exist. So there's case law. There's also Attorney General opinions in the state of California that basically all contribute to the guidelines that we have about mandated reporting. And I want to, especially because I'm being recorded, I want to make very clear that I am not providing legal advice. If you ever have any questions about whether something is reportable, you should err on the side of caution and call the child abuse reporting hotline and have them tell you whether they're going to take a report or not, and or consult with the legal counsel of the agency that you work for. So this is general guidelines, it is not legal advice. So what we know from a combination of the mandated reporting law, case law, and the Attorney General opinions is that involuntary, forced, or coerced sexual activity involving a minor is always reportable regardless of the minor's age. So if it's forceful, if it's coercive, if it's involuntary, it's always reportable. Whoops, I think I went. Tanya, my little buttons are not popping up to go backwards. I'm wondering if you can pop me back to the slide. Hey, thank you. Okay, incest, even if voluntary, is always reportable. So basically, if there's somebody who's a family member, that's always reportable. Even if everybody's cool with it, it's always reportable. And what I want to say about that is the exception to that is the kinds of cases that we talked about on Tuesday with sibling stuff, right? That should be evaluated if it's normative child sexual behavior that happens to involve siblings that are of similar age and size, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. you can assess that to not be sexual abuse. On the other hand, if it's a 12-year-old, I had a 12-year-old brother who was orally copulating his 8-year-old brother every time they would go to bed. They shared a room, and he would coerce him into the top bunk bed. That was reportable. Okay, now here's where it gets sticky. Voluntary or consensual sexual activity may or may not be reportable. And you basically need a law degree in California to pull all of these various sources together. And so this is probably the one thing that you'll all be grateful about, that there is a chart available, and I'm going to give you the citation for the chart. But if you'd also like some additional philosophical underpinning of how some of the case law got decided, this next slide, Resources on Reporting Guidelines, include 3 different resources that you can get kind of a philosophical overview that we won't have time for in general here, but a philosophical overview of how some of the current reporting guidelines got put into place. Whoops, Tanya, I want to go back to the slide just for 1 second. Thank you. So this second bullet, Child Abuse Council of Santa Clara County, has a document called Child Abuse Reporting Guidelines for Sexual Activity Between and with Minors. And there is the website. I believe Alameda County has something posted on their child abuse prevention website as well. Other counties may also. This was the first, and it continues to be regularly updated from Santa Clara County, and really has tied together all of the different case law and Attorney General opinions about what is and is not reportable. And I'm just trying to find my note. So basically here, and I did not write these on a slide because they're too complicated to sort of write down one by one. I really, really encourage you when we're done with the training to log on to that website and just pull up that document with its chart. It will make your life a lot easier. But basically, the summary of it is that in general, there's a few exceptions. In general, if both kids are under the age of 14 and there's a similar age group and there's similar age difference and there's no coercion, intimidation, manipulation, threats, etc., no report is required. If one child is under the age of 14 and the other child is over the age of 14, so even if the other child is still a minor, if one child is under 14 and the second child is between 14 and 17, a report is going to be required, which, in some cases makes a lot of sense when you have a 17-year-old who's doing something with a 10-year-old. But when you've got a 13-year-old whose little boyfriend just turns 14, all of a sudden we get into reporting territory. And the reason for that is because if you think back to the very, very early slide that we had and what the different crimes are in California, there are some crimes that are very specific to kids under the age of 14. So if you're over the age of 14, it becomes legally reportable. Do those cases where we have a 13-year-old and her 14-year-old boyfriend usually get prosecuted? In my experience, the answer is no. But are they technically reportable? Yes. If both minors are between the ages of 14 and 17, no report is required unless the sexual activity involves some other indicators of abuse or exploitation. Now, here's the interesting one, which may surprise you. If the child is 14 to 17 and the other person is 18 or older, a report is not required. Remember, you always may report if you have some suspicion that something is exploitive, but no report is required if the child is between 14 and 17 unless it involves unlawful sexual intercourse with a child 14 or 15 and a person over the age of 21. And that is also related to one of those early laws that we looked at. There is a specific law, 261.5 in the Penal Code, and another one, 288 parentheses C parentheses 1, that looks specifically at kids that are 14 and 15 years old. recognizing that although they are teenagers, there's still a difference between somebody who's 14 and somebody who's 17. The last thing I'm going to say about that is that there is a big problem in the way our reporting law is written, in that the things that I've discussed so far kind of apply to fondling and touching and even heterosexual sexual intercourse. There's a case law that involved 2 kids under the age of 14 where there was a report made because the 12-year-old was pregnant, and the case law ended up saying you shouldn't have reported this because they're both the same age, it was consensual, yes, she's pregnant, but there was no other indicia of abuse, and so kids have some kind of a right to privacy, and it specifically dealt with a case where there was heterosexual intercourse. So that case law has informed a lot of the guidelines that I just said. However, sodomy, something going into an anus, Penal Code 286. Oral copulation, so genital oral contact, going either way, boys, girls, Penal Code 288, small letter A, and penetration by a foreign object, Penal Code 289, which means some object going into the anus or vagina, including a finger, which is an object, are still listed as reportable offenses in our penal code. But the problem with that, there are multiple problems with that. Number one, most kids do put fingers in before they ever dream of having intercourse. And yet we're required to report a finger going in because it's a foreign object, but we're not required to report if they're having consensual heterosexual intercourse, providing that they fit into these age guidelines that I've described. So it actually doesn't make developmental sense. The other thing that doesn't make sense is that heterosexual vaginal intercourse, again, depending if they're the same age and they're both under 14 or they're both between 14 and 17, or one is 14 and the partner's less than 21, and again, that'll all make more sense to you when you download your chart, that all applies to heterosexual sexual activity. But sodomy, if you're a heterosexual teen and you're experimenting, you're going to experiment with that. Or in a committed relationship, that's what you're going to be doing. If you're a gay or lesbian teen, you're going to be penetrating with a foreign object. You're going to be sticking fingers in, and you're going to be licking each other, oral copulation. Those things are actually still always technically reportable when there's a minor under 18 involved. There have been a couple of recent cases that have more to do with prosecution of those crimes. People v. Hofshire in 2006 and Lawrence v. Thomas in 2003, which cast doubt on the constitutionality of treating those types of consensual sexual activity differently from sexual intercourse. But right now, those laws are still on the books. So I'll leave you kind of with that. And I really, really encourage you to download the chart, which will make all of that stuff much more clear. What happens once a report is made is that there are 2 parallel streams of investigation and adjudication. One is the criminal justice system, which involves police, city and district attorneys, and the criminal courts. And the standard for prosecuting is beyond a reasonable doubt. In order to take a case of child sexual abuse to a criminal court, at the stage that they're thinking about filing, the prosecutor has to reasonably believe that they can get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, with 12 people unanimously agreeing that child sexual abuse occurred to a 99% degree of certainty. And that helps explain why many cases of child sexual abuse don't get prosecuted, because can you really prove a case if all you have is a 6-year-old's word against someone else's? And it puts a very tremendous amount of pressure on the 6-year-old, but it also makes the prosecutor legitimately have to question about whether 12 people are really willing to believe that, when either the defense doesn't have to get on and say anything because they don't have to self-incriminate, or they come up with some other reasonable hypothesis. The mom is mad at the stepdad, they're having a custody thing. It's not very hard to come up with a reasonable doubt. So it's the criminal justice system. The other way, though, that we protect kids is through the dependency court system. That involves child protection agencies, the juvenile dependency court, allied treatment professionals that see kids who get where reports are made. And that standard, it starts lower, but eventually goes up to a preponderance of the evidence. So a 75% likelihood. So it's much easier to protect, not easy, as any of the child welfare or juvenile attorneys who are on the line will know, but it is a lower burden of proof in order to protect kids. Lots and lots of professionals get involved in reports of child sexual abuse. One of the most exciting developments, I think, in the last decade or more is the coordination of investigation. Whereas a decade or two ago, it was really common for kids who were victims of child sexual abuse to have to be interviewed on average a dozen times by different people before a decision was made about their case. Many communities now have programs called Children's Advocacy Centers or multidisciplinary investigative teams, MDITs or MDTs, that have dedicated staff, a dedicated site, programs that meet national standards so that the various disciplines can work together to minimize the interviewing and trauma of kids, just system-induced trauma for kids. Those professionals include this whole list: law enforcement, child welfare, prosecution, victim advocacy and mental health, forensic medical specialists, forensic interview specialists, and any other professionals that the local team decides would be useful on their team. Those are folks that get involved once you make a child sexual abuse or other kind of child abuse report. In closing, I just want to go over the references and recommended reading, and then we have about 10 minutes for questions. So for a really good overview, I'd recommend the chapters in the APSAC Handbook on Child Maltreatment and a website, National Child Traumatic Stress Network. That's what I mentioned before. You could spend days just kind of archiving through their website. And for some good prevention education, Darkness to Light is a really great website. So that is it. Tanya, I want to see if you can get us set up for some Q&A.
Okay. Thanks, Miriam. We have quite a few questions that people have asked, so I'm just going to kind of start here at the top and go through. So our first question.
And I just want to remind people again, so nobody hangs up the line frustrated, if we don't have time for your question, I have already responded by email to anybody who asked a question whose question wasn't answered yesterday. So I really do promise that I will respond by email if we don't get to your question.
Absolutely. And if anybody, if for some reason the system didn't record your question, you can always feel free to email me the question, and we will respond to it that way as well. So the first question we have is, it's part comment, part question. I work in children's services and often work with new foster parents. I would like some advice as to how to explain children's typical and atypical behavior to foster parents and how to teach them to cope with it, whether there or not there's knowledge that the children have been sexually abused. Also, if a child were to disclose sexual abuse to a foster parent, whether they should stop the disclosure or continue to allow them to disclose, and what should they do with that information once it's received?
Okay, great question. I'm going to answer the last part first, and then I'm going to actually give you a resource for the first part of your question. So the last part, and this is true for foster parents and really anybody who's listening to a child's initial disclosure of child sexual abuse, the most important thing is really just to listen and to use prompts that are just facilitators and not interrogation prompts. So it's like, thank you for telling me about that. Tell me more about what happened. I see. And then to, so whatever the child spontaneously says, to document to the best of your ability, kind of jot down what the child's verbatim responses, or what the child's verbatim disclosure was, and then to go ahead and report that. If you're a foster parent, to your caseworker, who's going to be a mandated reporter, or whoever the listener is, to be able to get that to the attention of somebody who can get that further investigated. I will tell you from being on a forensic investigation team that one of the biggest challenges that we have, particularly with young children, is the contamination of those early reports, where somebody is so desperate to get more information that they basically say, did this happen, did this happen, did this happen, did so-and-so do it, did so-and-so do it, did so-and-so do it? And children are kind of yes-no questions are notoriously unreliable, particularly for young children. Their accuracy is not nearly as good on yes-no kinds of interrogation questions than questions about, thank you so much for telling me about that. Tell me everything you remember. And whatever they disclose kind of spontaneously with their own memory search is much more reliable and then useful to child welfare professionals and law enforcement and prosecution. So I would just say, put on your best listening ears if you're a foster parent, and then report to a child welfare worker who can engage whoever is identified in that agency to do a more formal interview of what happened. So that's I hope, the second part of the question. The first part of the question, we could really spend all day long just talking about, and I do foster parent training. One of the best resources was, if you were on the call on Tuesday, there was a booklet in the resources and whatever section at the very end by Tony Kavanaugh Johnson. It was specifically written for parents and caregivers of all kinds, including foster parents. But if you go on her website, which was in the notes from Tuesday, she does have some specific information available for purchase and also some for download, unique to foster parents or kids in residential care. And when I say for purchase, those booklets are about $2.50. They're not, hugely expensive materials.
Great. Okay, so let's move on. The next question is someone had a question. You referred to the term survival sex, and they wanted clarification about that.
Okay, thank you. So survival sex is really a kid being out on the street and trading sex for food or money just so they can survive. It's a form of exploitation or human trafficking.
Great, thank you. Someone had a comment and they wanted clarification regarding the penal code section for the definition of sexual abuse. They believed it was 11165.1, not 11166.1.
Oh, I'll check my slide. It is 11165.1. They're absolutely correct. Thank you. There's a typo.
Okay.
11165.1. Okay. Thank you.
Great, and I will put that that correction on the notes, and that can be re-downloaded for everybody if they need to.
Thank you, Tanya.
Great. Let's see. The next question, let's just do a couple more. I know we've gone over time by a couple minutes here, but let's just do a couple more. Is there research that states how a non-touching sexual behavior and touching sexual behavior impacts the child?
I can't point you to a specific study on non-contact sexual offenses. I would only return to what I said earlier, that I think the impact of any kind of sexual manipulation or exploitation is really about the meaning that the child makes of it. And so I think it's very possible to be quite upset and even traumatized by something that is a non-contact offense, such as viewing pornography, being forced to watch a perpetrator masturbate, even if there's no actual touching. So it's really about the messaging that goes on and the meaning that the child makes of it. And I think you could argue, that those same principles apply to non-contact offenses. That it would be, as a general rule, do we think that the actual acts themselves and the severity of them contribute to whether a child experiences trauma or distress as a result of it? Yes. As a general rule, the more severe, yes. But there are so many other factors. If you look at the slide on that, including age and development and relationship to the perpetrator and the messaging, that it is a very, very individual kind of response.
Great, thanks. I think at this point we do have quite a few, like over 20 questions left. So I think at this point we're going to try to answer those individually. And I just wanted, before we start losing a lot of more people, because some people are starting to drop off, I just wanted to go over a couple more things about the follow-up for the webinar. So let me just move the slide here. Okay, so I just want to thank everyone again for attending. My email is up in the top corner, and you also received it in all of your confirmation materials, and you can feel free to ask me any other questions that you might have regarding the webinar or the content, and I'll be able to forward the content questions on to our presenter today. You'll receive an email from us probably by tomorrow afternoon with a link for the session's evaluation. And if you take a moment to provide us with feedback for that, you will be taken to our website where you can download your certificate of attendance for today and an application for your CEUs. Anyone who emailed me in advance of the training asking for CEUs, I will go ahead and email those to you as well. And I just want to remind everybody that on our facts page you can download both the session's notes pages and the PowerPoint slides. And I will be making an update to today's notes session with that correction on the slide. So if you want to re-download that, it should be up by the end of the day. I think that's my screen is flashing that we're over time, so I'm going to let everybody go. And I just want to thank Miriam one more time for joining us over the last 2 days. We really appreciate it, and we will talk to everybody soon, hopefully. Thank you.